Leave us out here, and we won't make it till morning." The words didn't sound like a threat, or a demand, or even a negotiation. They sounded like truth, cold, quiet, and final. The wind howled across the empty Colorado mountain road, slicing through the night like a living thing, rattling the frozen branches and burying everything in sight under inches of relentless snow. Visibility had dropped to almost nothing, just a blur of white and shadow, the kind of storm that didn't just slow you down, it erased you. 15 people stood stranded in that storm, their expensive coats now useless against the biting cold, their polished shoes soaked through, their confidence dissolving with every passing minute. These weren't ordinary travelers. These were billionaires. Men who owned companies, who signed deals worth more than most towns would see in a lifetime, who commanded rooms with a glance and bent outcomes with a word. But out here, none of that mattered. Not the money, not the influence, not the power. Out here, they were just human. And they were losing. William Carter stood at the center of the group, his jaw tight, his breath visible and short, controlled bursts that betrayed the tension he refused to show. At 52, he had built an empire that stretched across continents, a name that carried weight in every major financial district in the country. He was used to solving problems, used to control. But this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation. This was nature, and nature didn't negotiate. Their convoy had stalled miles back when the storm intensified without warning, engines freezing, signals dying one by one, until even the GPS gave up and went dark. Now they were walking, blindly, hoping for anything, a cabin, a light, a sign that they weren't completely alone. Then someone saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Not bright, not welcoming, just there, a small, stubborn light pushing against the storm. They moved toward it without hesitation, drawn by instinct more than logic, boots crunching through layers of snow, shoulders hunched against the wind. As they got closer, the shape came into focus. A modest house, one story, weathered wood, a porch half buried in snow. It didn't look like much. It didn't look like something that could save 15 lives. But it was the only thing standing between them and the cold. Inside that house, Ava Brooks had just finished wiping down her kitchen counter, her hands moving slowly, methodically, the way they always did after a long shift. She had gotten home less than an hour ago from the diner down the road, the kind of place where people didn't remember your name but expected your smile. Her feet still ached from 10 hours on them, her uniform folded neatly over the back of a chair, her hair tied back in a loose knot. The heater hummed softly in the background, filling the small space with just enough warmth to make it feel like shelter. She didn't have much. A couch that had seen better days. A narrow bed in the next room. A fridge that was never quite full. But it was hers. And it was quiet. Then came the knock. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just a dull, desperate sound against the door, almost lost in the storm. Ava froze for a second, her breath catching, her eyes shifting toward the entrance as the wind rattled the frame again. Another knock followed, slightly stronger this time. She stepped closer, cautious, her hand hovering near the handle as she listened. Outside, through the frosted glass, she could make out shapes, figures moving, unsteady, bundled against the cold. For a moment, she didn't open the door. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the barrier between her world and whatever was waiting on the other side. Because she knew one thing for certain. Once she opened that door, everything would change. The handle felt colder than it should have, like the storm had already found its way inside, seeping through the cracks, testing her resolve before she even made a choice. Ava Brooks tightened her grip, her fingers steady even as her thoughts raced, because this was the moment that separated instinct from fear, and she had lived long enough to know that hesitation could cost more than action ever would. She turned the knob slowly, the door creaking open against the pressure of the wind, and the storm answered immediately, rushing in like it had been waiting, carrying snow, cold, and the sharp sting of reality with it. For a second, everything blurred. The warmth inside collided with the freezing air outside, and in that space stood 15 strangers, their faces pale, their shoulders heavy, their eyes searching for something they were not used to asking for. Help. No one spoke right away. Not because they did not have something to say, but because none of them were used to being the one standing at the door. William Carter stepped forward first, his posture still carrying traces of authority, but the edge was gone now, softened by the cold, and something deeper, something quieter. He opened his mouth, then stopped, as if the words he had used his entire life no longer applied here. Ava studied him for half a second, not long enough to judge, but long enough to understand. These were not men who lacked options. These were men who had run out of them. She pushed the door open wider without asking a single question. "Get inside," she said, her voice calm, firm, leaving no room for hesitation. They did not argue. They did not negotiate. One by one, they stepped over the threshold, bringing the storm in with them, snow falling from coats worth thousands of dollars, boots leaving wet trails across a floor that had never seen this kind of presence before. The house felt smaller with every person who entered, the walls closing in, the air shifting, the quiet replaced by the sound of heavy breathing and the soft shuffle of movement. Ava closed the door behind them, shutting out the wind, but not the weight of what she had just allowed in. 15 lives. 15 stories. 15 unknowns. She moved quickly, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she understood something they did not. Survival was not about comfort. It was about order. "Coats off," she said, already clearing space, already thinking 3 steps ahead. "If you stay in those, you will not warm up." There was a brief pause, a flicker of hesitation, the kind that comes from people who are not used to taking instructions, especially not in a place like this, especially not from someone like her. Then William spoke again, quieter this time, more certain. "Do what she says." And just like that, the shift was complete. Power did not disappear. It changed direction. Ava grabbed the spare blankets she had, thin and worn but clean, handing them out without comment, without ceremony, as if this was just another part of her routine. She pointed to the couch, the chairs, the floor, dividing space in a way that made sense only because she made it make sense. The heater worked harder now, humming louder, fighting against the cold that still clung to them, but it was enough. It had to be. One man rubbed his hands together, his movements slow, almost disbelieving, as if warmth was something he had not expected to feel again that night. Another sat down carefully, like he was afraid the moment might break if he moved too fast. William remained standing for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, the worn edges, the small kitchen, the life that existed here without ever needing his approval. Then he looked at Ava, really looked at her this time, not as a role, not as a title, but as the person who had just done what none of them could. "You did not have to do this," he said, his voice low, almost lost under the hum of the heater. Ava did not stop moving. She adjusted a blanket, checked the door, glanced toward the window where the storm still raged like it had something left to prove. "Yeah," she said simply, her tone even, her focus unchanged. "But I did." And in that moment, something settled in the room. Not comfort. Not yet. But something close to it. Something that could grow if the night allowed it. The house had never held this much silence before. Not the peaceful kind that comes at the end of a long day, but a different kind. Heavier. Filled with thoughts no one was ready to say out loud. The storm outside kept roaring, wind pressing against the walls like it was trying to remind everyone that this shelter was temporary, that safety was fragile, that nothing about this night was guaranteed. Inside, the air slowly shifted from shock to awareness. The cold had not disappeared, but it was retreating, inch by inch, replaced by something unfamiliar to most of the men in the room. Dependence. Ava moved between them without drawing attention, her steps quiet, her focus steady, checking each person the way someone does when they understand that small details matter. A blanket adjusted, a chair repositioned closer to the heater, a glass of water placed within reach without being asked. She did not rush, but she did not waste time either. Every movement had purpose. Every action said the same thing without needing words. "You are safe for now." One of the men, younger than the rest, sat on the edge of the couch, his hands wrapped tightly around a ceramic mug Ava had placed there minutes earlier. He stared into it like it was something rare, something he had never quite appreciated before. Steam rose slowly, curling into the air, carrying a warmth that felt almost personal. "I have not had coffee like this in years," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Another man let out a soft breath, leaning back against the wall, his shoulders finally dropping for the first time since they had entered. That is because you have not needed it like this in years, someone replied, and a faint, tired smile passed between them, not about status or success, but about something simpler. Survival. William Carter had taken a seat near the window, though there was little to see beyond the blur of snow and darkness. He watched the glass for a moment, his reflection faint, distorted by the frost forming along the edges. Then his attention shifted again, back to Ava. She was in the kitchen now, opening the refrigerator, pausing for just a second before making a decision. He noticed that pause. Not hesitation, but calculation. She was counting, measuring, deciding how far what she had could stretch. He stood up slowly and walked toward her, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance that had settled over the room. "You do not have enough for all of us, do you?" he said, not as an accusation, not even as a concern, but as a simple observation. Ava closed the refrigerator door gently, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "No," she answered, "but we have enough to get through the night." There was no apology in her tone, no explanation, just certainty. William nodded once, absorbing that answer in a way that felt unfamiliar to him. In his world, not having enough meant finding a way to get more, calling someone, moving resources, changing outcomes. But here, there was no one to call, no system to lean on, just what was already inside these walls. And somehow, that was going to be enough because she said it would be. He stepped back, giving her space again, understanding something he had never needed to understand before. Control was not always about having more. Sometimes it was about knowing how to use what you had. Ava gathered what little food she had, a loaf of bread, a few cans, some fruit, placing everything on the small table as if it were part of a larger plan. She did not present it like a limitation. She presented it like a solution. "We are going to keep this simple," she said, her voice calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. Conversation stopped. Eyes turned toward her without hesitation now, without resistance. Small portions. Slow eating. Stay close to the heater. We make it through the night, and that is all that matters. No one argued. No one questioned. Because in a room full of people who had built empires, the only person who knew how to survive this night was the one who had nothing to prove. And for the first time in a very long time, they listened. The night did not get easier. It simply became quieter, the kind of quiet that forces people to sit with themselves, to feel things they usually outrun, to hear thoughts that do not belong in boardrooms or private jets. The storm outside continued its relentless rhythm, wind pushing against the house in long, steady bursts, snow piling higher against the walls, sealing them in further with every passing hour. Inside, the warmth held, but barely, the heater working like it understood what was at stake, its low hum now the heartbeat of the room. Ava stayed on her feet, not out of restlessness, but out of responsibility, moving through the space like she was reading it, sensing when someone needed something before they asked for it. She refilled cups with hot water, adjusted blankets that slipped, checked the door more than once, her eyes. Always calculating, always aware. One of the men, older, his voice carrying the kind of authority that usually filled conference halls, spoke into his phone again, even though he already knew it would not work. "Still nothing," he muttered, lowering it slowly, the glow of the dead screen reflecting in his eyes. Another man let out a quiet laugh, not amused, just resigned. "We have spent our entire lives staying connected," he said, shaking his head slightly. "And the one night it matters, we have nothing." Ava heard that, but did not respond, not because she disagreed, but because she understood something they were just beginning to learn. Connection was not always about signals. Sometimes it was about presence. William Carter leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped together, his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before lifting again. "How long have you lived out here?" he asked, his tone measured, not intrusive, just curious in a way that felt new for him. Ava paused for a second, then answered without turning it into a story. 5 years. He nodded once, absorbing the simplicity of that answer, then asked the question that followed naturally, even if he did not fully understand why he was asking it. "Alone." Ava gave a small shrug, the kind that carried more truth than explanation ever could. "Not really." The room fell into a softer silence after that, not empty, but reflective, because the meaning was clear even without details. Being alone was not always about who was in the room. Ava stepped toward the window briefly, wiping a small section of frost away with the edge of her sleeve, looking out into the storm not with fear, but with familiarity. She had seen nights like this before. She had lived through them. And she had learned one thing every time. You do not fight the storm. You outlast it. Behind her, the men began to shift, not physically, but mentally. Their conversations quieter now, more grounded, less about deals and numbers and more about small, human things. One spoke about his daughter learning to ride a bike. Another mentioned a place he used to visit as a child, long before any of this. The edges of who they were began to soften, stripped of titles, reduced to something simpler, something more honest. William listened to all of it, but his attention kept returning to Ava, to the way she moved, the way she carried herself, the way she seemed unaffected by the imbalance of the situation. You are not worried, he said after a moment, not as a question, but as an observation. Ava turned slightly, meeting his gaze just long enough to answer. Worry does not make the night shorter, she said. It just makes it heavier. The words settled in the room, quiet but firm, like everything else she had said. No one challenged it. No one needed to. Because out there, beyond those walls, the storm was still doing what it was going to do. And in here, for the first time in a long time, they were learning what it meant to simply endure. Time moved differently after midnight. Slower, heavier, like every minute had to push its way through the cold before it could exist. And inside that small house, the space between seconds stretched just enough for doubt to begin creeping in. The heater was still running, but its rhythm had changed, no longer steady, now uneven, like it was struggling to keep up with the demand placed on it. Ava noticed it immediately, her head tilting slightly as she listened, not reacting outwardly, but adjusting inwardly, the way someone does when they have learned to read problems before they fully arrive. She stepped closer to it, crouching briefly, placing her hand near the vent, feeling the airflow, measuring the temperature without needing a number. It was weaker, not failing yet, but not as strong as before. Behind her, the room had settled into a fragile calm, most of the men sitting quietly, some with eyes closed, not sleeping, just conserving energy, their bodies finally giving in to the exhaustion they had been holding back. One man shifted under his blanket, pulling it tighter around his shoulders, his breath still visible in the dim light. Another rubbed his hands slowly, trying to hold on to the warmth that had taken so long to return. Ava stood up, her movements still controlled, her expression unchanged, but her focus sharper now. She moved toward the small closet near the hallway, opening it carefully, scanning what was left. 2 extra blankets. A thick coat she rarely used. A box with old supplies she had kept for winters like this. She paused for a second, not because she was unsure, but because she was calculating again, stretching what little she had into something that could last a few more hours. William noticed the shift before anyone else did, not because he understood the situation fully, but because he had spent his entire life watching for change, for subtle signs that something was about to turn. He stood up and walked toward her again, his voice low, careful not to disturb the others. Something is wrong, he said quietly. Ava did not look at him right away. She reached into the box, pulling out a small flashlight, checking it briefly, then setting it aside. The heater is getting tired, she replied, her tone calm, as if she were describing something ordinary, something expected. William frowned slightly, glancing toward the unit, then back at her. What happens if it stops? The question lingered for a second, not dramatic, not panicked, just real. Ava finally met his eyes, her answer simple, grounded. Then we adjust. There was no fear in her voice, no urgency, just a plan that had not yet been spoken. She moved back into the room, her presence shifting the atmosphere again, drawing quiet attention without asking for it. Everyone up for a minute, she said gently but firmly. The men stirred, some slower than others, confusion flickering across their faces as they adjusted to being called back into awareness. We are going to move closer together, she continued, already guiding them with her hands, repositioning chairs, clearing space on the floor. Body heat helps. It keeps the warmth where we need it. There was a moment, brief but noticeable, where hesitation returned, not out of resistance, but out of unfamiliarity. These were men who valued space, privacy, control. But none of those things mattered now. One by one, they followed her lead, shifting closer, blankets overlapping, shoulders nearly touching, the distance between them shrinking until the room felt even smaller, but somehow stronger. Ava draped the extra coat over one of the older men, adjusting it around him without a word, then stepped back, scanning the room again, making sure every piece fit the way it needed to. The heater let out a soft click, then another uneven hum, still working, but barely. William sat down among the others now, no longer separate, no longer observing from a distance. He looked around, taking in the scene, the closeness, the shared silence, the absence of hierarchy. For the first time in years, he was not the center of anything. And for the first time, he did not need to be. Ava remained standing for a moment longer, her eyes moving from one person to another, not as strangers, not as billionaires, but as lives she had chosen to carry through the night. Then she finally sat down too, near the edge, close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to see everything. Outside, the storm showed no sign of stopping. But inside, something stronger had taken its place. Not comfort, not yet, but resilience. And for now, that was enough. Somewhere between night and morning, the storm lost its voice, not completely, but just enough to change the way the house felt. The wind no longer screaming but pressing, steady and low, like it had settled into waiting instead of attacking. And inside, that shift did something to everyone without them realizing it at first. The air was still cold, the heater still struggling, but the urgency had softened into endurance, the kind that does not demand action every second but asks for patience instead. Ava had not slept, not even for a minute, her eyes adjusting to the dim light, her body still, but her awareness constant, tracking every small sound, every movement, every change in temperature like it was part of a language she had spent years learning. Almost unnoticeable, but intentional. William Carter watched that from where he sat, his eyes half open, his mind somewhere between exhaustion and clarity, and for a moment he did not move, did not speak, just observed something he had never paid attention to before. Care that did not expect anything in return. He let out a slow breath, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "You have done this before." It was not a guess. It was recognition. Ava glanced at him briefly, then looked back toward the room, her answer simple, almost understated. "Winter does not change just because we want it to." He nodded slightly, understanding more from that sentence than the words themselves. There was history behind it. Experience. Something earned, not learned. The first hint of gray began to creep through the edges of the window, faint at first, barely visible, but enough to mark a change. Morning was coming. Not bright, not warm, but present. Ava stood slowly, stretching her arms just enough to wake her muscles, then walked toward the window again, clearing a small section of frost with the side of her hand. She looked out for a long second this time, her expression steady, her breath slow, and something shifted in her posture, not relief, not yet, but confirmation. The storm had passed its peak. Behind her, William stood as well, moving closer, careful not to disturb the others, his voice lower than before. "Is it over?" Ava shook her head slightly, not turning. "Not over, but it is letting go." That distinction mattered, because letting go meant time, and time meant possibility. One of the men stirred more fully now, blinking as he sat up, looking around as if trying to remember where he was, his mind catching up to his body. Another followed, then another, the room slowly waking, awareness returning piece by piece. There was no panic this time, no confusion, just a quiet understanding that they had made it through something that could have gone very differently. Ava moved back into the center of the room, her voice calm but clear. "Hours ago." One of the men ran his hand across his face, then looked at Ava with something that had not been there before. Respect, yes, but also something deeper. Gratitude that did not know how to express itself yet. William stepped forward again, stopping just a few feet away from her, his posture different now, less defined by control, more by presence. "We owe you more than a thank you," he said quietly. Ava met his gaze for a second, then gave a small, almost dismissive shake of her head. "You do not owe me anything," she replied. "You needed a door. I had one." The simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else she had said that night, because it stripped everything down to what mattered. Not who they were, not what they had, just what was needed and who was willing to give it. Outside, the light grew slightly stronger, the storm pulling back inch by inch, revealing a world that looked completely different from the one they had walked through just hours before. And inside that small house, 15 men who had once controlled everything were now standing in a place where they had been saved by someone who never needed control to make a difference. The door did not open with urgency this time. It opened slowly, deliberately, as if the night itself needed to be acknowledged before it could be left behind. And when Ava turned the handle again, the storm greeted them differently, not as an enemy, but as something that had already taken what it could and moved on. The wind was still there, but softer now, carrying loose snow across the ground in thin, drifting lines instead of blinding waves, and the sky above had begun to lighten into a pale gray that promised visibility, if not comfort. One by one, they stepped outside, not as a group of powerful men reclaiming control, but as survivors measuring their footing carefully, their steps slower, more aware, as if the world itself had changed its rules overnight. The road that had disappeared hours ago was beginning to reveal itself again beneath layers of uneven snow. Tire tracks faintly visible in places, broken in others, but enough to suggest direction, enough to offer a path forward. William Carter stood just outside the doorway for a moment longer than the others, his eyes scanning the landscape, then shifting back to the house behind him, to the small structure that had held more weight than any building he had ever walked into. Ava remained near the door, not stepping too far out, her arms crossed loosely against the cold, her posture relaxed, but her attention still fixed on the details, on how they moved, on whether the ground beneath them held steady. "You should stay close to the road," she said, her voice calm, carrying easily in the quiet air. "The snow is deeper off to the sides." They listened without question, adjusting their steps accordingly, their formation tighter now, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Complete. The sound of their steps faded slowly, replaced by the soft movement of wind across snow, and for the first time since the night began, the world felt still again. She stood there for another moment, letting the cold touch her face, letting the silence settle fully, then turned back inside, closing the door behind her with the same steady motion as before. The house felt different now, not empty, but returned, like something that had expanded for a moment and then gently folded back into itself. The blankets were still scattered, the chairs slightly out of place, the air carrying traces of what had happened within those walls, but the space belonged to her again. Ava moved through it slowly, picking up what had been used, straightening what had shifted, not rushing, not reflecting too deeply, just restoring what was hers. Outside, the road stretched on, carrying 15 men back toward the world they knew, but something had changed, something that would not be undone by distance or time. And inside that small house, the quiet remained, steady and unshaken, holding the kind of strength that does not need to be seen to exist. Morning did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like the world itself was testing whether it was safe to move again, and by the time the sun finally pushed through the thinning clouds, Ava Brooks was already back in motion, not thinking about the night as something extraordinary, but as something finished. The house had been restored to its quiet rhythm, the blankets folded, the chairs returned, the small traces of 15 lives erased not out of denial, but out of habit, because this was how she moved forward. Outside, the snow still covered everything in a soft, blinding white, but the road had cleared just enough for the occasional vehicle to pass, distant and rare, like reminders that the world had resumed without needing permission. Ava stepped out onto her porch with a mug in her hand, the warmth steady against her palms, her breath visible in the crisp air as she took in the stillness that followed the storm. Nothing about the scene suggested what had happened just hours ago. No footprints remained. No voices echoed. Just quiet. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Just deliberate. Ava set her mug down on the railing beside her, her hands now free, her stance grounded as she waited, not asking, not assuming, simply present. William stopped a few feet from the porch, looking up at her with the same calm focus he had carried through the night. But there was something else now, something quieter, something that did not come from power. "We said we would not forget," he began, his voice even, carrying clearly in the still air. Ava held his gaze, her expression unchanged, her response unspoken but understood. The line of cars behind him stretched farther than either of them needed to acknowledge. because what stood between them now was not about what had arrived, but about what had already been given. And for the first time since the storm, the balance of the world shifted again, not through force, not through control, but through something much simpler. Recognition. William did not step onto the porch immediately, and that hesitation said more than any speech ever could, because for the first time in a very long time, he was not arriving to take control of a situation, he was arriving to acknowledge one. The men behind him stood in quiet formation, no longer the restless figures from the night before, but not quite the same as they had been either. Something in them shifted, grounded by an experience none of them could measure in dollars or influence. Ava remained where she was, her posture steady, her expression calm, watching not the cars, not the scale of what had arrived, but the people, because that was what had mattered from the beginning. William finally took the last step forward, stopping at the base of the porch, looking up at her without the distance that had once defined him. Last night, he said slowly, choosing his words with care, we had everything we thought we needed. He paused, letting that settle, not as a statement of fact, but as a reflection of what they had believed. Then he continued, his voice quieter now, more honest. And it was not enough. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with understanding that did not need to be explained further. Ava did not respond right away, not because she was searching for the right words, but because she did not feel the need to fill the space. She had never needed to prove anything to them. She still did not. William gestured lightly behind him, toward the long line of vehicles stretching down the street, each one representing a world that had once felt untouchable to most people in this neighborhood. We brought something for you, he said. But even as he said it, there was a subtle shift in his tone, an awareness that what stood behind him was not equal to what had been given. Ava glanced past him briefly, taking in the sight, not with awe, not with rejection, just recognition. Then her gaze returned to him. You did not have to do that, she replied, her voice even, the same grounded tone she had carried through the entire night. William gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in her words. No, he said, but we needed to. That distinction mattered, and he knew it. Because this was not about repayment. It was about response. One of the men stepped forward then, holding a small envelope, offering it with both hands, not as a transaction, but as something closer to respect. Ava looked at it for a second, then gently shook her head. If this is about money, she said, then you missed the point. There was no tension in her voice, no accusation, just clarity. The man paused, uncertain, then looked to William, who did not seem surprised by her answer. Instead, he gave a slight smile, not of amusement, but of understanding. It is not just money, William said, stepping closer again, his voice steady. It is opportunity. It is security. It is something that lasts longer than one night. Ava considered that for a moment, not because she was tempted, but because she understood what he was trying to offer beneath the surface. She had lived long enough to know that not all help was equal, and not all generosity carried the same weight. What I did last night, she said slowly, was not an investment. Her eyes met his again, firm, but not unkind. It was a choice. William nodded again, more firmly this time, as if that was the answer he had been expecting, or maybe the one he needed to hear. He turned slightly, signaling to the others, and one by one, they stepped forward, not with gifts, not with grand gestures, but with something simpler. Words. Gratitude spoken without performance, without expectation, each one carrying a piece of what they had experienced, each one different, but all rooted in the same truth. Ava listened, not interrupting, not dismissing, just receiving what was offered in the way it was meant. When the last of them had spoken, the street fell quiet again, the line of cars now just a backdrop, no longer the focus. William looked at her one final time, his expression settled, no longer searching, no longer uncertain. You opened a door, he said, and it changed more than just one night. Ava gave a small nod, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged from the moment she first turned that handle. Doors do not change anything, she replied softly. People do. The words lingered, not as a lesson, but as a reflection, something that would stay long after the cars were gone, after the street returned to its quiet rhythm, after the world moved on as it always does. William stepped back then, not turning immediately, as if taking one last moment to stand in a place where power had not defined him. Then he turned, walking back toward the waiting line, the others following without hesitation. Engines started again, one by one, the sound building, then fading as the cars began to move, leaving the street slowly, deliberately, until the last one disappeared around the bend. Ava remained on the porch, her hands resting lightly at her sides, watching until there was nothing left to see. Then she picked up her mug again, the warmth still there, still steady, just like before. Because in the end, nothing about her had changed. And that was exactly why everything else